classic works, The Shining.
And it's a very, very interesting proposition to talk about The Shining because it is a reimagining of a pretty famous and popular work by another artist, and that secondary work is the more famous of the two, which rarely happens when you have a remake of something or a reinterpretation of an original. So I'm going to give you some context of like where we were, where the artists were, a bit about them, their conflicts, and really sort of I'm not going to say it's a deep dive into everything about The Shining, though I feel like a student presenting his sort of final thesis, because I've been doing like a month's worth of research for this. Anyway, and I loved it anyhow, so it was a fun process to do. So let's just get started with some of the details of it. So the novel, it was, when it came out, it was like a different time in publishing. If you went to a bookstore in the 70s, there weren't like science fiction section, horror section. There might be in certain bookstores, but not in every bookstore. And so the industry didn't really have effective genres yet. So King's success Stephen King's success with his books had sort of a momentum and gravity that caused a whole bunch of imitators and publishers searching for other authors to make that sort of same success that he had with his first books. So when The Shining came out in 1977, it kind of, he had 2 books out before that, but it was his first sort of bestseller in hardback, and that was a big deal for him. It was making a lot of money. It was sort of solidifying his reputation. And yes, I did write The King of Horror, which was a really low hanging fruit. But it was well received by most people, and there was a small but fervent group of people who started identifying themselves as horror aficionados, horror hounds. This is only, it's only 9 years, after the success of The Night of the Living Dead, which really sort of changed the way people viewed horror as something that could be, totally invested in its horror roots of monsters and scariness, but it also had bigger things to say about society. So at that time, in 1977, Stephen King already had 2 books out. He had Carrie, which was his first book. He published it in 1974. He was 27 years old. To me, that's just outlandish. I didn't even start writing until I was 37. And it had already been adapted into a film directed by Brian De Palma, and it was a huge hit, and it had 2 Academy Award nominations, one for Sissy Spacek and one for a more technical thing. And then his second novel, published in 1975, had also had a mini-series adaptation directed by Tobe Hooper, who was the director who did the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, another sort of, I don't really like that movie, but it is a seminal horror film that a lot of people look to as one of the classics. Both of these movies, Carrie and Salem's Lot, are absolute bangers. They're really good movies. Just as a little personal note, when I was a kid, I walked down into my, the one on the left, that's Salem's Lot. This is vampires. The other one is a teenage sort of prom horror. But I walked down in 1970-something to my parents' den, and on the TV was this scene with this kid scratching at the window, asking his brother to let him in. And I went into a fugue state. I screamed and ran back into my room. It was like the most scary thing I've ever seen. But so I was very, very, very scared of that image, and it stuck with me. Recently, I showed my son this movie, and it's a 70s movie. It has David Soul and flared bell bottoms, and you know, it is a very much a 70s movie, but the more we watched, the more my son was like, oh my God, this is a great movie. This is really scary. Anyway, so King had already had some successes. And in Carrie, you have some Travolta. Gotta love a movie that features John Travolta. Well, so King had his successes, but Stanley Kubrick got wind of this book, and he optioned it. In 1977, Kubrick was already a legend. So he had made all of these movies by this time, and he was renowned for being a genius. He was a megalomaniac, a perfectionist. There's a lot of like things that people would call Kubrick. He had aggressive and challenging works. He also made money for studios. Most famously, he directed a smaller film called Paths of Glory that had Kirk Douglas as a star, and Kirk Douglas went on his next movie. He had his production company doing Spartacus, and there's a man named Anthony Mann who was the director of Spartacus, and Kirk Douglas said, I'm not really getting along with him. He's not just being my servant. He's doing what he wants to do. How about we fire him and use this kid I worked on in this last movie, Stanley Kubrick, and he'll just do exactly what I have to say. So they fired Anthony Mann and got Stanley Kubrick. And Stanley Kubrick was like, nah, I'm going to do exactly what I want. I'm going to do, it's Stanley Kubrick show. And they fought a lot, but he delivered the goods, and he did it under budget, and it made a ton of money for the studios. So suddenly he could do whatever he wanted to. And he was well aware of his reputation. He used it to his advantage. So he went from like small films to like ever-growing larger films with larger production period times. And so, he did masterpieces, Spartacus, Lolita, maybe not a masterpiece, but it's a classic of literature. Dr. Strangelove, a classic and a masterpiece. 2001, Clockwork Orange. And then he came to Barry Lyndon, and it was a failure. It was one of his things where by the time he had gotten to doing Barry Lyndon, he was sort of like a creature of his own reputation. So he wanted to shoot it all with natural light. So he got he was always a gearhead, and he he insisted on shooting it without any lighting, and it all had to be within driving distance around his manor in London. He he wouldn't allow it to be any further because he is very insular, and he didn't want to do anything that was out of his range where he could just drive to it. So it was a total box office failure. It's a boring movie. I mean, ostensibly, I think you can just watch it and, yes?
What is that top picture of?
That is Stanley Kubrick. Young Stanley Kubrick. Yeah, young Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick this is a little side note just because I have all this information swimming around in my brain. When he was in high school, he graduated at 17. He was not a good student, but he did like photography. He liked the mechanics and the detail of photography. And he took pictures for his school, and he was trying to figure out how to sort of make this into a career because he could, in the time period that he was coming out of high school, all the GIs were returning from World War II, and so with his poor grades, he could not get into any college in America. So he had to sort of find a job. So he started hanging out at Look magazine's sort of freelance photographer pen and following around these guys and sort of learning from them. And FDR died, and Stanley Kubrick went out and took a shot of this older gentleman who sold papers, and he's very sad looking at the headline, FDR dead. And he used that picture that got picked up by Look magazine and it got him a job. But apparently later it turned out that he made that old man take like 20 pictures in various poses just to get that exact thing. So he kind of cozened his way into having a life as a photographer, and from there he worked for Look magazine shooting all sorts of stars, but also doing like assignments where he follows a boxer around for a day. And after he did this one photojournalistic essay about following a boxer around for a day, he's like, I feel like this should be more of a film. It's sort of like I'm doing the pre-production for a film. And at the time, they would bundle, some of you, I'm sure some of you already know this, but they would bundle short films, often sort of journalistic films in front of other movies. So you'd see a short film, and then you'd see a longer film. And he decided he was going to make that photojournal essay about the day of the fight into a short film, which he did, and he lost a lot of money, but he learned a lot. And he learned, most importantly, that he liked control, which sort of followed the rest of his career. Anyway, at this time, after Barry Lyndon, which was a failure at the box office, got trashed by reviews, he was offered a movie around when he was doing it by the studios called The Exorcist, which was just played here 2 nights ago, a classic film, and it was also a huge success worldwide because it was a very Catholic film. Everyone knows about The Exorcist, the possessed girl, but after he refused it, I think the note that he sent back to his production company was, or someone wrote it for him, but it was Mr. Kubrick chooses his own projects, right? He doesn't do what the studio wants him to do. Anyway, after its success, he got jealous of it, and he resolved to make the best horror movie that has ever been made. So he moved from that to the pre-production of The Shining. So it's important that we talk about. I'm going to take off my jacket because I'm sweating. He cultivated his own eccentricities, right? Because it helped him in production and getting what he wanted and keeping control. Like some of the things he did was he went and got a pilot's license, but later he would not fly. He would not. So that's one of the reasons why he insisted productions were close around his house. He wouldn't drive in a car that was going over 35 miles an hour, but he had super nice cars that would go 200 miles an hour. He stored and cataloged everything with a precision that was maniacal. And I'll show you more about that later. But he's also like a huge gearhead. He loved the newest technologies. He loved figuring out new ways to do, to shoot. So in his wake, from all the movies he had previously, he left sort of like a lot of hurt feelings, lawsuits, because it was Stanley Kubrick's way or the highway. He had a production company called Harris Kubrick Films early on, and his partner said, Stanley will always agree when you're right, but he'll spend $1 million to prove that you're wrong. And I think that followed him throughout the rest of his career. But most notably, when it comes to Stephen King, he had left a whole, a phalanx of writers who hated him in his wake. So this is the co-writer of Paths of Glory. And this quote was taken like maybe a movie after Paths of Glory, so he had not sort of become Stanley Kubrick yet. But, a near psychopathic indifference to and coldness towards human beings in the story. Barbara Greene, who is the cousin to Graham Greene, the novelist, said, "Humanity was to him like a heap of insects he liked to examine, as a scientist might examine his specimens, coldly and clearly." I'm so glad you're here, J.O. In A Clockwork Orange, the woman, Adrienne Corey, who is the woman that suffers a gruesome rape scene, one day in production, she brings in a photocopied picture of Jupiter and Thetis and throws it down in front of him and says, "That's who you think you are." Anyway, when I read that in the biography a couple weeks ago, I was like, well, I can just walk into my living room and take a photo of the painting that J.O. Buckley, who's sitting right in front of you, did. And he gave it to us as a wedding gift. So that was a wonderful little point of convergence about these things. So he had a real reputation. This is what Kirk Douglas said. He was a bastard, but he was a talented guy. He had, in this one biography, the writer John Baxter said he was perversely antagonistic with the people he worked with. He loved when something went wrong, when someone did something, like it was a challenge to him. There's a story about in filming Eyes Wide Shut, where it's just a scene where a guy is playing pool. And at this point, Stanley Kubrick was Stanley Kubrick, right? He was this legend. And the actor, who's just a nobody, it's just a non-speaking role. He shoots the pool, he shoots the shot, and then Stanley Kubrick goes, "That's good, moving on." And the guy goes, "Well, I can give you a different," thinking that Kubrick would want more than just a one take. He's like, "I can do more." And Kubrick was sort of peeked out from behind his camera and sort of, observed him with his own eyes, and then went back, and he made him do that scene over and over for the next 5 hours. Anyway, one of the other things he would do is when he was younger, before he started making movies and to support his little small journalistic features, he would hustle chess in Greenwich Village. He would play people for money just to get money to, because he had that kind of mind. He had a mathematical mind. He had a procedural mind. And so whenever someone would, usually men would push back on anything he wanted, he just challenged them to a game of chess and then dominate them. But do it without really sort of paying that much attention to it. Just sort of come back and move a piece, and then go on about directing, and then come back. And it was especially effective with George C. Scott in Dr. Strangelove, who was really frustrated by a lot of the things that were going on that set, because he was also one of the biggest names. Him and Peter Sellers were the two biggest names. There is a documentary called Stanley Kubrick's Boxes. And it is after his death in 1999, I think. 8 years later, a guy came out with a documentary. But for those 8 or 9 years in the interim, he had been going to Stanley Kubrick's house and allowed to look at the contents of all the boxes of Stanley Kubrick's. And Stanley Kubrick was a hoarder, but he was a very organized hoarder, and he was rich enough to have space for it. He had a manor house, but then he had a huge old school carriage house that was 10,000 square feet, like a warehouse, that was full of boxes. And inside of it, it was just corridors of boxes, like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they hide the Ark. It was just sort of, just maniacal, a little bit disturbed sort of hoarding. Every picture ever taken for a production, every note, everything he documented. And a lot of that, I think this is one of the things that made Kubrick, in the public eye, someone that people called a genius, was because of his attention to very small and granular details on everything he did. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But here is from Stanley Kubrick's Boxes, just a quick run through of all the location research photos, not all of them, just little bits of boxes that he did for everything. It's just exhaustive. And apparently he could be exhausting. For example, notes. Here's one. Jim, please see that there's a supply of melons kept in the house at all times. Do not let the number go below 3 without buying some more. Thanks, Stanley. Here's one. This one's perfect because it's like what we would Google today. He just sent a note. He wrote a note this long to his assistant to figure it out. Please check with the Weather Bureau and find out the barometric pressure in London, what the barometric pressure in London was last Friday, 11th of October, between 6 p.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning. Also find out if the average of the barometric pressure is on most days of the year, and what is considered extremely high and what is considered extremely low, and how they would describe the pressure on Friday, 11th of October, during the times I've mentioned. Which, that's just funny to me. I wish I could do that to people. Like, can you imagine that type of power? Come in here. Here's what I want you to do. Type it up, print it out. Go ahead. Get me that info. That would be awesome. But he had that. Okay. So in all these boxes, he had fan letters, right? Every fan letter he read, every single one of them. He never responded to any of them. But he marked on the top of every fan letter, FP, fan letter positive. There's a positive. FN, fan letter negative. And then he had files in which, from the cities from which they came. So he filed them by city. And he also had a whole series of this is a crank letter. So sometimes he would just write crank, because it's usually some man who thinks they know better, right? Okay, and so I know I've gone a long way to sort of give the real dirt on his sort of mental weirdness, but he liked his cats. And so this one says, please call up some sort of cat league or society or something like that, or a pet shop. Find out if they make any kind of collar that you can attach to a little ball to keep the cat from killing many birds, but will break away if the cat catches himself on a tree or branch instead of hanging the cat. Stanley. Well, so this is the guy that's coming to this horror movie. Anyway, so the pre-production starts. He's bought the rights to The Shining. So he sends his daughter and a couple other photographers to go out, and they go all around the U.S., but they find the exterior look, which is the Timberline Lodge in Mount Hood, Oregon. The interior design is Ahwahnee Lodge in Yosemite Valley, California. And then they start building at Elstree Studios they rebuilt the whole exterior of the lodge. They rebuilt the interior of the warren of hallways that you saw at the beginning with the kid riding down. And then they built a maze, the winter maze. They built the summer maze, and they also built the exterior of the maze that faced the fake exterior of the lodge. So yeah, and that was within 20 minutes of driving from his house, because it had to be close enough to his house where he could drive. So back to Stephen King and Kubrick. So the deal with Kubrick is he diverges from sources. Dr. Strangelove was originally a novel by Peter George called 6 Minutes to Doom. And it was very serious. It was much like the movie Failsafe, or in the book Failsafe. 6 Minutes to Doom was super serious. And somewhere in the beginning of the production, Stanley Kubrick was like, it's just the possibility of nuclear war is so outlandish and overwhelming. You can't deal with it seriously. You have to deal with it satirically. You have to laugh at it. And he hired a guy named Peter Sellers. He hired a guy, Peter Sellers, to be in it, but a guy named Terry Southern to make it funny. And so Terry Southern came in and rewrote everything, the script that they had already done that was serious, and he made it funny. He made it, he changed the names of everyone in it. He really sort of cranked up the humor. And and that left Peter George, honestly, Peter George wrote a bunch of other books But then he was offered, after Strangelove came out, the chance to write a novelization of the movie, which was a satirical one, and he did, and it outsold all his previous books, including the one that the actual movie was based on. And at 41, he committed suicide by shotgun because of, like, a lot of it was, this resentment he had towards like the devaluation of his work by Kubrick that sort of played out on this larger stage. So, and there's a whole litany of the way he treats writers. There's only really 2 writers that have good things to say about him in all my research. One is Vladimir Nabokov. Loved it. Loved his Lolita. Why? Because Vladimir Nabokov, like, he could barely get that published in the States, but when it did, it became huge. But he was just happy that they managed to get a film version of that book that got through the censors and got published and made money. And then the other one was a woman named Diane Johnson, who wrote this screenplay of The Shining. But Stephen King wrote a screenplay, and he like, after a couple conversations, he refused it. He's just like, we'll get someone else in here. And he had read this book called The Shadow Knows. And The Shadow Knows is Diane Johnson's novel that is about a woman who's being stalked and starts thinking that she's losing her mind. Her sanity starts to crumble. Sound familiar? So that's what, that is, the way he sort of wanted to go with King's screenplay. The main difference is the horror is not overt. It's internal and subtextual, and that is really the King and Kubrick's fundamental disagreement. King believed in real external evil forces, right? Like demons. He might not even believe in them, but he liked to write about them, and they were real things, like vampires. Telekinetic powers that were things that you would literally affect the world. But Kubrick believed, like he famously said in response to Stephen King, I don't believe in hell. So he was talking about internal evil, internal inherited evil. And Kubrick always got what he wanted. Just presenting this picture of Stephen King because I love him, but it also is just the perfect encapsulation. Like, he is a horror fan, and I don't think Kubrick was. Like, he likes the sort of, the jumpy, the creepy, the spooky, and Kubrick was trying to make a Kubrick film. Okay, so we're in the pre-production, we're moving to the cast. Sorry, I laugh at this just because I've been living with this for so long. Jack Nicholson. Now, already, Jack Nicholson, at this point in Jack Nicholson's life, he had been nominated for 5 Academy Awards, and he had just won one for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? If you look at the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest versus the Shining, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, about a guy in an insane asylum, it's a subtle and nuanced performance compared to the performance in The Shining. Everything in The Shining is over the top from Jack Nicholson, like his job interview face. Like, in the real world, you're having an interview with a guy and he looks like that at you, saying Jack Nicholson stuff. You're like, no, we're going to be moving on. We have a better interviewee scheduled for later. But Jack Nicholson at the time was going through a breakup with Angelica Houston. He is moving out of there, and he had to move to London for what he thought was going to be like 3 months, but it ended up being much longer. He was in London, and he was a huge star at this point, and he was partying and doing cocaine and going out to parties every night and really just living a big life. Kubrick had always wanted to work with him since he saw him in Easy Rider, because Kubrick, this is something that he devoted tons of his warehouse to, was his unmade Napoleon epic. And he wanted Jack Nicholson as Napoleon, which I think in an alternate universe, there is a Jack Nicholson as Napoleon movie out there doing his eyebrows and everything. But he plays Jack Torrance, a writer. And I think it's also important to note that Stephen King's books in his early career, other than like the very first one, most of them, the first 20, always have a protagonist that's a writer, right? In Salem's Lot, it was, I don't remember the character's name, but he was going back to Salem's Lot to write a book about the town. This one, Jack Torrance is a failed writer, but is trying to write. The next one is, it's just one after the other. They're all writers until he gets to about 50, and he figures, oh, I can research other jobs. In his defense, he became a novelist at 27. Like, I could barely tie a tie at 27, so, Shelley Duvall. Shelley Duvall was coming to this from having a bit role in Annie Hall, and a bunch of Robert Altman early films. And she was also going through a breakup from her boyfriend and so she was already in a sort of disturbed mental state when she arrived there. She's Texan, so she has a unique look in a drawl, like you can hear it in her voice that she's from Texas. When I was talking to my dad about doing this, he's like, I hated that movie. That woman's ugly. And I was like, are we looking at the same person? Like, for me, I was like, I guess when I was a kid, I thought she was odd looking, but as an adult now, looking back, I see just how luminous she is. She's gorgeous. She has huge eyes. Stephen King said the role was not good for her, and neither was the relationship with Kubrick. That's unfortunate, and I'll go into more on that later. Danny Lloyd is as Danny Torrance. It's also a weird thing I noticed. There's some similarities. Stephen King, Stanley, S.T., Kubrick, same letters. Jack Nicholson plays Jack Torrance. Danny Lloyd plays Danny Torrance. It's funny. But the kid, honestly, he's the best. He's one of the better performances in the movie. He does great. He came out unscarred by anything, and apparently is living his best life right now. Just having a good time. All right, and then my favorite, Scatman Crothers. Scatman Crothers plays Dick Halloran, another person with the shine. And if you everyone's seen The Shining, right? They know the premise, right? You haven't seen The Shining. Well, spoiler alert. It's about a haunted hotel, and the young boy who's the son of the newly hired caretaker has the shine, or a extrasensory perception, and he meets, when he gets to the hotel, the head cook, which is played by Scatman Crothers, who also has the shine. So the cook starts speaking to him in his mind to mind, and kind of acting like a guide to warn off the boy from the sort of dangers, the supernatural dangers that the Overlook Hotel holds. Also, he's the star of the show. Look at Scatman. He's just amazing. Anyway, they went into, these were, Jack Nicholson, who had worked with him before on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was the guy who recommended Scatman Crothers. Scatman would later come to regret that. The production. So it started, I think, the actual filming and everything started about 2 years before it was released, so in '78. It's important to note Stanley Kubrick's shooting style. He liked to shoot everything tons of times. So many, there's a scene, he shot it, the staircase scene in which Jack Nicholson is menacing Shelley Duvall, Wendy Torrance, on these stairs. That was a very long take where they have to come up and she's swinging a bat and he's getting his hand hit. 127 takes. They said in the filming of it, because at this point they were pretty deep in the production, that Jack Nicholson would do the first few takes big, and then he would sort of like tone them down to sort of conserve his strength. And then he'd start building in intensity and ferocity again, just because they were doing it so many times. And at this point, Shelley Duvall was not as she was not as a veteran actor as Nicholson. She was also being bullied by the director more than Nicholson was. And so she started really suffering from stress from this type of style. George C. Scott said when they shot Dr. Strangelove that he was not prepared for the iterative style of filmmaking where they do countless takes. And invariably, he said, he would always take my most manic and eccentric performance. He wouldn't take the ones that were subtle or had anything that was like, any sort of like nuance. He would take the ones that were just outrageous. And this was the same with this movie, and especially Jack Nicholson's takes. So before this movie, Jack Nicholson was an actor with some range. But he did the same in this movie, so every take of Jack Nicholson's was the most manic or outrageous or eccentric. And by the end, when this movie came out, Jack Nicholson was kind of like hemmed around in concrete in his own image. He suddenly became the Jack Nicholson that we know of, like a caricature of himself. And later, like only 8 years later, he would play, or 9 years later, he would play the Joker in Batman, which is like even like the Jack Nicholson persona cranked up to 11, a homicidal maniac, right? Anyway, there's a scene, if you haven't seen it, in which Wendy is hiding in the bathroom with a knife, and he's been totally possessed by the ghost of the hotel to kill her. And that's what the ghosts want. They want them to relive and reenact atrocities. So he's got a fireman's axe that he's pulled from inside the hotel, and he goes to the door and he chops it open. The thing that Kubrick didn't know is Jack Nicholson used to be a volunteer fireman, and like the first door, he went through it like butter. I mean, he just went right through it, and full of manic energy, probably fueled by cocaine. But when he did that, when I have here iterative and reactive, he didn't tell Shelley Duvall that that's what was going to happen, that the door is going to be broken down with an axe. So he's shooting Shelley Duvall. Jack Nicholson goes to the door like nothing, and he's getting Shelley Duvall's real surprise and fear at what's happening, because he had her in a state of absolute, like near nervous breakdown, which later she did have a nervous breakdown. She was losing her hair. Anyway, another thing is Halloran comes back to the hotel to sort of rescue everyone. In it, Jack Nicholson hits him in the chest with an axe, and Scatman Crothers had to fall to the ground, and he was 73 years old. He made him do it 40 times and sent him pretty much to the hospital. And he would just go, not to the hospital, but he sent him to, like, he had to go, the nurse on set was like, we got to go take care of the Scatman. And he would just, like, Kubrick would be like, that was great, do it again. That was great, do it again. That would be what he would say over and over and over again. At one time, he did 100 takes of them just walking through the kitchen and Scatman telling them where everything was. And at some point, Scatman broke down and said, just tell me what you want, Mr. Kubrick. He was crying. Just tell me what you want. And he's like, I want you to do it again. Anyway, one of the big, okay, I don't want you to think that I'm just bashing on Stanley Kubrick, but he deserves a little bit of bashing for this, I think, for his methodology. But one of the big things, technological things in The Shining is the use of the Steadicam, which, I don't know if you guys came in early, but I was showing I made a loop of the kid, Danny, riding his tricycle around the hotel, And it was, the camera sort of seamlessly follows the boy and it's all because it's a gyro stabilized camera that you can see here. And it wouldn't do for just any camera operator to run the camera. He got the guy who invented the Steadicam to do it for him. Like, he was like, no, I'm gonna get the guy who made it. And there's a funny story in there's a very funny story in John Baxter's biography where when they were doing the hedge maze scene where he's chasing Danny Torrance through the snow, Stanley would often, while he's running beside him, grab the camera and try to control the shot. And he knew that it was bothering, it was often pulling him off and making the camera tilt on axis so that, the horizon line would tilt. And it was actually causing problems, and that footage was unusable. So he knew that, I guess this is time I should introduce into this sort of play, Vivian Kubrick. While all this is going on, Vivian Kubrick, his 17-year-old daughter, was filming behind the scenes. And during the course of this movie, she filmed over 120,000 feet of film, of 16 millimeter film during the making of it. And she was very much, the crew knew if they said anything bad, complained anything in the earshot of any of his assistants or his family, word would get back to Stanley Kubrick. So Garrett Brown, who is the inventor, and he's like 6'6", big guy, pretty muscular. He worked on Rocky, and he told a story purposefully, an untrue story, to someone within earshot of Vivian Kubrick, saying that Sly Stallone used to grab my camera while we were doing stuff, and I knocked him out. And so the next time Stanley Kubrick reached out to sort of tug his camera off to get the shot he wanted, he sort of stopped and was like, could you move it to the left? And anyway, Kubrick was, but Kubrick, I can see how Kubrick was like super excited to have this new piece of gear, a toy. He's a tech head. He liked cameras. So it was the perfect bit of gear for Kubrick. But this had, the shooting schedule, Kubrick's treatment of Shelley Duvall was kind of wearing. And there is actual footage. Of the 120,000 feet of footage, there are a couple of shots in it that show sort of Kubrick and the results, the wreckage of his process. And here's one of them. This is when Shelley Duvall is having a nervous breakdown. Yeah, that's all there is on it. Kubrick, when his daughter had finished the behind the scenes, he culled out all the stuff he didn't want in there, like cocaine use and like when he's really berating Shelley Duvall. Here's another one. This is one where, well, I'll just let Kubrick speak for himself. Don't sympathize with Shelley. In his defense, at the end of the movie, all she had was kind things to say. Like, he taught me a lot. Like, it was hard. It was stressful, but he taught me a lot about movie making. Here is Scatman Crothers ostensibly talking about Danny Lloyd, the boy, but also breaking into tears. And it's kind of a weird vibe that he presents. But I'll just let you watch it yourself.
How did you find working with this halfway. Was it enjoyable? It was beautiful. Just like my son. You see tears, it will be tears of joy. Because I thank the Lord I've been there, was able to work with such beautiful people.
He later went on, his next movie was directed by Clint Eastwood, who is famous for doing one take. And it's Bronco Billy, I believe. It might have a longer title. But after the first day, he broke down in tears there and said, "Oh my God, I can't believe how wonderful this is." Okay, so one of the big things is the sets on The Shining. How are we doing on time? Honey, am I going too fast? Am I doing the right speed? She was worried that I would just race through everything. Okay. Well, I do have to race through some stuff, so I'm going to hit the high points. This is called the Colorado Room. When I watched it as a kid, I thought this is a real place. It's actually a set. The next set, it burnt because of all the lights. It became the Well of Souls in Indiana Jones. And that was what it was the next day. Funny story, Vivian, they were still shooting The Shining in other parts, and Vivian Kubrick came on the set of The Well of Souls and didn't like the way the snakes are being treated, so she called in the ASPCA, and they came and they shut down production, and Kubrick loved it. And he's reportedly said, smoking a cigar, watching when they were shutting down the production, "Steve's a jerk." Anyway. So there are themes in the movie. If you stick around to watch the screening of it, you'll see them. I'm going to quickly go through these, but there is a theme of mirrors. There's a theme of mazes, labyrinths, and impossible architecture. You'll see some of them. Subtextual monsters. There are ghosts, there are scary things, there's scary imagery, but a lot of it could just exist in the characters' minds. There is a repetition of language over and over. Jack Torrance's character speaks a lot in just cliches and repeats them over and over. And then there's the inherited evil. Here's some of the mirror imagery. Kubrick was fascinated with symmetry in his shots, so that heightened the mirror images. Most famously, the mirror image reveals the phrase "red rum," which Danny Torrance has been repeating in a psychic fugue state. The hedge maze is, I think, this is one of the few bits of the screenplay that was totally developed by Kubrick. He came up with the idea, and I think it was probably a great idea. It was a very good idea because of a couple things. One is a man. The story is about a man who is lost in the maze of his own psyche, and so it has become externalized in the hedge maze, but also, this is the one trick shot in The Shining, it's also mirrored by the maze of the Overlook Hotel, which you could get lost in. And, as I showed in the beginning, the boy driving his tricycle in the corridors and sort of getting lost. And J.O. was saying, "I'm getting sick, I can get sick." So the maze, the repetition of imagery, the mirrors bring the story into a hyper-real sort of situation where images take a lot more dominance than characterization or plot or story. This room, the scene, this is a bit of impossible architecture. This is a scene in the middle of the building, but it's an outside thing. Here's the shooting for the actual maze they created in the winter. This is the shooting maze. They had to have a map of the maze so they could shoot the maze, which was, I think, fascinating. All right, now we're going to get to the lunatic fringe, and I'm glad I'm running out of time because I didn't want to really spend a lot of time on all the lunatic stuff that people think about Stanley Kubrick. There are a bunch of theories. If you want to watch them, I'm sure you can check them out from from the library. There's a movie, it's also on Amazon Prime, called Room 237. It talks about all the sort of weird conspiratorial theories about The Shining. In those, there are a few plausible ones. It's, people say it's really about indigenous genocide, Native American genocide. Then people say, oh, it's really about the Holocaust. Or no, there are no ghosts, it's all inhabiting Jack Torrance's mind. All of those are actually the only plausible ones. There's some crazy ones out there. I'm telling you, it's a rabbit hole that you can go down and be like, spend a long time. The indigenous stuff is bolstered by things like the calumet baking powder, which means a peace pipe. Calumet is a peace pipe, and they think that it's talking about the broken treaties of Native Americans. There's this scene where Shelley Duvall is wearing a red coat, 2 braids, and they run into the maze, and she says to Danny, the last one in has to keep America beautiful, referencing the crying Native American in the littering campaign of the time. And she has, the whole place is decorated with Native American art. And then there is this sort of stuff that they talk about. It's about the Holocaust, really. And they use the German typewriter, the Adler, which means eagle, the preponderance of the number 42 in it, which is the year that they decided to enact the final solution. So he has 42 on his sleeve. They're watching the summer of 42 on a TV with no electrical cord, so it's another sort of impossibility. And then the most sort of ridiculous one is there's a crossfade where everyone points to, and I'll just play it for you, that they see a Hitler stash in. Anyway, as I said, there are hundreds of nut jobs opining on it. You can spend a good 2 days looking at ridiculous theories and guys. I'll say here that when someone is acclaimed as a genius, there's a lot of people out there who want to explain to you how he's a genius because they want a little bit of that genius to rub off on them. And it's usually guys. It's usually dudes doing that. The reception. Stephen King did not like it, hated it, in fact. That's what's wrong with Kubrick's The Shining, basically. The movie has no heart. There's no center to the picture. I wrote a book as a tragedy, and if it was a tragedy, it was because all the people loved each other. And he's got a point. At no point do you think, Jack Torrance loves his wife. He's a prick to her the whole time. He doesn't show any kindness to his son, really. It's interesting. And it got trashed. It got really, really trashed. I'm just going to quickly go through these. They use the R word, and I blotted it out because y'all don't need to see that. Chicago Tribune didn't like it, but it was a hit. Despite having a $19 million in 1970s, it made $47 million. That's a pretty good run, but it's not set the world on fire. How much time we got? I got 4 minutes. This is the funniest slide. I didn't see The Shining when it came out. I was 9 years old. I heard verbal retellings in the playground, mostly about a kid saying red rum in a haunted hotel and whatever. But in the 70s, that's how I first came to The Shining, was other kids saying, yeah, and then he chases people around with an axe, and then you see in the mirror that the red rum is really murder backwards, and that's how I got it. And it was only later when I was in my teens that I actually saw the film. Anyway, that's Pulaski Heights Junior High, where I was about the time when I heard about it. Anyway, it was a big deal. It was a big deal when I finally got to see it. It was on HBO, and we didn't have HBO, and so I kind of invited myself to the richest kid I knew's house to spend the night to see it, and finally, and that was a good night. I'm going to skip this one because it's just more stuff. But in the end, The Shining is hailed as a classic. You know, over time, movies tend to grow in the public consciousness. The images embedded in this movie are, you know, subliminal in some ways. They are, like, I can just sort of name them off, like the two twin girls in the hallway, the gouts and torrents of blood coming out of the elevator, you know, just classic scenes, the man chasing the boy through the snowy maze, Jack Nicholson's face appearing in the door saying, "Here's Johnny." I mean, they've become parts of American visual language and lexicon. So it is a classic. I am going to wrap it up now. I'm going to open it up for any questions if we have time. And then I've got a lot of my sources here. And then you can watch the making of The Shining that Vivian Kubrick did. You can watch Stanley Kubrick's Boxes, which is all about his maniacal storing of stuff. And 2001 that did inform a little bit of this. But I really appreciate you guys coming to it. And yes, J.O.
The two girls in the hallway are the source of the image of a political cartoon in the newspaper today.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not.
I was trying to figure out why that was familiar, what it meant. And that's what it was derived from.
Yeah, I mean, this has been satirized and lampooned and referenced and made homages to. It's one of the most, like, a lot of directors will say, this is one of the things I look to is, like, how to shoot a movie, because the imagery is so striking and so stately and so choreographed. You know, I think where it falls a little bit flat is the characterization. Like, you know, it's like Jack Nicholson just being Jack Nicholson. It's hard. You can like the movie. I think I like the movie sometimes and think it's funny because Jack Nicholson is just being Jack Nicholson. You know, like you know, he's so over the top. But do I care about his character? Am I broken up about the destruction of this family? It's kind of hard because also it's like a really misogynistic treatment of Shelley Duvall. Like the way they treat her, she's just always panicking and like out of control and stuff. And I don't know. It's a real interesting. It's a great movie, and it deserves its place in history. But that does not mean it's not without flaw, in my opinion. And anyway, I really thank you guys for letting me ramble on. What's that? Oh yes. You can look here. I've learn more about me in my books and my website. John Hornor Jacobs. My middle name is almost spelled like horror, but it is. They're all. I thought they'd be for sale out here, but they're not. So anyway, but they're for sale where all fine books are sold. Anyway, thank you guys very much for coming out. I really appreciate it. I don't have any more slides.